Hi, it's Gary and it's good to be back with you. In episode 15, which was the last video that I discussed construction techniques with you, I showed you how I brace and carve the braces on a soundboard, demonstrating how the flexibility, the weight, and acoustic properties of the assembly changed during that process. Now we're ready to put the soundboard and binding on the guitar, so in this video I'll show you how I fit the soundboard, glue it to the sides, and inlay the bindings and purflings. This video will be slightly different than the previous videos in that it will be more show and tell about the process and less about the acoustics. Let me say up front, these are all well-known approaches that have been discussed before in many books and videos, but I'll point out some of the smaller details that have made my life a lot easier. Feel free to fast forward or skip around this video, and once we're done with this work, I'll come back in episode 18 to talk about the acoustics of the closed box, which is pretty interesting. So let's get started. We'll start here with a spruce cedar double top that I built in episodes 14 and 15, and if you remember, it was built with a 28-foot radius in the lower bout. I'm going to glue it to this back and side assembly that sits in an outside mold shown in this photo. For now, I won't go into the details of how I built it, but it's made of cocobolo, the sides are laminated with mahogany to increase the rigidity, and the back is braced in a very standard way with a 20-foot radius. The lower linings are solid mahogany and the upper linings are reverse curved mahogany. I don't believe solid or reverse curve makes a difference, it's just my aesthetic choice for what you can see through the sound hole. The upper bout has a tapered fall-away to accommodate an elevated fingerboard, and you'll notice my upper transverse brace is locked into what I call a paddle that sits on top of a head block. All of these components in the upper bout sit in one plane to serve as the infrastructure for the adjustable action neck design that I use. I have a video on my YouTube channel that shows how that works if you want to see that. But this structure should work equally well for a bolt-on or glued-on neck. Okay, so the first operation I need to do is to radius the sides and lining in the lower bout to 28 feet to complement the radius that I have in the top. I'll do this by sanding with a dish momentarily. But first, let me comment on the fall-away for the elevated fingerboard. I profile the sides in the upper bout starting a taper from just below the sound hole. At this transition point to the lower bout, I put a tangential arc to smoothly connect the two sections. Then I apply the radius in the lower bout, create a dead flat plane in the upper bout, and then blend this transitional section with a bit of 28-foot radius. Before sanding the rim, I use a pencil to mark witness lines that will completely disappear when all the surfaces of the rim are sanded. Then I sand with a radius dish fitted with adhesive paper to prep the lower bout and some of the transition zone. Next, I sand the upper bout with a flat board and check that it's perfect with a straight edge. The top is taped into position, and from the side I mark the positions of the lower transverse brace where I will eventually cut mortises with a router. With the top off, I transpose the marks to the top of the rim and connect the marks from both sides to create parallel lines. Finally, I mark the lines with tape so I can clearly see where to cut. Now let me show you how I'm going to guide my router on a track system. The track is simply two pieces of aluminum angle iron joined with spacers that are the same width as my router's base. I'm going to line it up so the router's bit will cut between the tape that I put down because I've standardized it so that the bit is the same width as my brace. In this case, it's 7.8 millimeters or 3/16 of an inch. For the depth of the cut, I standardized my brace ends to 2.8 millimeters tall using a hardwood depth gauge. So to set the depth of my bit, I suspend the router with 2.8 millimeter spacers and adjust the router so that it just touches the top of the rim. I use spring clamps to steer and hold the positions on both sides, come back and check once more, and then make the cuts. It's just about perfect every time. With this method that extends all the way through the sides, you just need to make sure that the height of your binding and purfling combo is more than the total of your soundboard plus the brace, so it hides your brace ends. Alternatively, you can stop short of routing all the way through and tuck your braces into the pockets. You can see here that the procedure works equally well for the back braces. Before attaching the soundboard, I apply my label and put the glue on the rim, simply spreading it with tape over my finger. I'm going to protect the soundboard with a somewhat flexible piece of acrylic, which also helps distribute the clamping pressure. I really like these cam clamps, but I've also used a go-bar deck in the past. Once the top is on, I trim the overhang with a flush trim bit. Now I'm ready to start the binding process, and my first order of business is to protect the top with some adhesive plastic. It's the kind that you can buy in hardware stores to protect your floors and carpets. This step is crucial for protecting the delicate double top, but it's also great for solid tops to give insurance against denting and getting things dirty. The film anchors binding tape firmly and cuts cleanly with a router. You'll see that I can do all of my operations normally with it on and only take it off towards the end of the binding process. My only caution is that the adhesive can be strong, so don't use it if your soundboard has run out, otherwise you might lift wood fibers when removing it. I've found that in certain rolls, if the adhesive is strong, I can lay the adhesive on the workbench first to dirty it a little and reduce the adhesive strength before using it. The tack will still be strong enough to hold the binding tape. But as an additional precaution, I first apply wash coats of shellac to the periphery of the soundboard, and that will also help seal the grain. Next, I put a craft paper mask over most of the top so that when I remove the film at the end, I only need to lift it from the edges where it was needed for the binding tape. Before I show you how I actually bind, let me show you the process in schematics, which is really nothing out of the ordinary. Here's a cross-sectional view of my top, side, and back assembly with the linings at the corners. Using a router, I'm going to cut a ledge into the top for the purflings and then another ledge for the bindings. I'll actually prepare the binding as a combo with purfling already attached to it. Then I'll fill with purfling and then stack the binding purfling combo next to it. I'm going to purposely make the purflings and bindings a little larger so that I can level them at the end to reveal fresh, vibrant wood. Here's my router setup. I have my body in a carriage, and then the router seated on a homemade mount that's attached to an arm that keeps the router at 90 degrees. The arm was an old piece of lab equipment that was being discarded, so lucky me. On the underside of the mount, I made what's often referred to as a donut. I made the donut out of plastic chopping board material, and it will ride on the surface of the top or the back as I move the guitar body past the router. In this view, you can see the cutter and one of 3 different size bearings that will ride against the side and index the width of the cut. So here we go, starting with the top purfling ledge. Next, the back purfling ledge. And now the binding ledges. There's one more cut I need to make before installing the purflings and bindings, and that's to cut the channel for the end graft. The graft that I use has a wheat design that I made in episode 2 that's flanked by 3 striped purfling. I have a stage that I made that guides my router. It has 2 brackets joined by bolts that can be tightened against the body, and a platform for the router that can be adjusted. The bit is the same width as my graft, and in this case it's 1/4 of an inch. I'll inlay the graft after I install the top and back purflings. Now back to installing the purflings. I'll start at the top, and when I'm done it will look like this. I make my purflings from scratch, gluing veneers with a waterproof glue such as Titebond 2, and then bend them with an electric heating blanket in my bending machine. I'll show you the machine some other time, but one helpful thing I want to pass on at this point is that I stack strips of cheap plywood against my purflings as I bend them. This will prevent the purflings from twisting and keep them nice and flat with respect to the face of the top or the back. I do a test dry fit starting at the waist, marking the cut positions at the tail. I'll stack the pair of purflings so that their ends will be cut at 45 degrees in a miter box. Then starting at the tail, I'll start to glue and tape. The protective plastic film on the top will hold standard binding tape just fine, and I can apply glue normally. Later when I pull off the film, it will easily release from the purfling, so no worries about the glue and film here. Now to the back purfling, where I have two 45-degree miter joints to contend with, one at the heel and one at the tail. I make my cuts with a chisel since my back purflings are smaller than those for the top. The cuts will end up looking like this. When I get to the lower bout, I'll dry fit, mark and cut before continuing to glue and tape. Once you have a good dry fit, for the sake of evenness, it pays here to first tape at the miter joint and then distribute the tape in divisions. And just as a technical note, if you're making this style of back with a center strip and purflings, you'll need to avoid routing away the center strip and create the rest of the ledge with a chisel, and then chisel the 45-degree miter in the purfling. Now is the time to glue the end graft. First, I prepare the graft by cutting the ends in a miter box so that the length extends beyond the graft's channel by the width of the purfling. Then I use a chisel to cut the 45-degree miter in the purfling. Once all of this is done, I glue it into the channel and proceed to the bindings. To make the binding purfling combo, I glue the veneers of the purflings to the board that will become the binding. For this guitar, the binding material is African blackwood, which were offcuts from a set of sides, and the purflings are Macassar ebony, which is sandwiched between dyed maple. I cut strips on my bandsaw and reduce the thickness on my drum sander. The ones for this guitar are the outer 4 strips in this photo. After bending, they're ready to install. I'll start with the top bindings first. To prepare the ends to fit the miters on the end graft, I cut the binding to length and chisel away some of the purfling to create the complementary 45-degree miter. It will eventually look like this. I'll show you in more detail how this is done when I fit the binding on the other half of the top. Here's how I fit the other side. Similar to what you saw for the purflings, in a dry fit I mark the length of the binding and cut it in a miter box. Then I mark the point where I need to start the miter in the purfling. I position the cut by looking for the mirror image that appears at 90 degrees. Cut and then snap off or chisel away the rest. If the binding ends up too long, I sand away a little with a sanding block until the fit is perfect and then start gluing and taping. Installation of the back bindings is similar to that of the top bindings, except special care is needed at the heel because with my neck attachment system, everything is in view at the heel, so I need to make a nice butt joint there. When I approach the heel, I mark it off and then cut the end using a little miter box that I made. With the binding tape removed, I start leveling the bindings and purflings, starting with the back. For the top face, I'll leave the protective film on and get the majority of leveling done before removing it. Because the outer veneer of the double top soundboard is thin, some special care is needed when leveling on the top. The strategy is to just level the bindings and purflings and not remove material from the top. What I'm trying to achieve is an extremely small downward angle, almost imperceptible relative to the top, so that I'm only removing up to the point where the purfling meets the soundboard. To do this, I wrap a loose layer of tape on the soundboard end of my scraper to elevate it off of the soundboard. I stop scraping when I'm at the level of the film. I'll come back later to remove the film and do some final leveling. Next, I level the end graft and sides. Once all of this dirty work for the back and sides is done, I remove the protective film off the top, which requires some care. The key is to divide and conquer, pulling low and slowly in the direction of the grain. You'll likely be left with some adhesive residue stuck to the top, but an art eraser rubbed vigorously will clean this up very nicely. Now I do a final scrape and follow with a judicious sanding of the edges with a random orbit sander set on low. I also treat the back in the same way, and this will even the surfaces to a final finish. Next, I round the corners of the bindings, first using an 1/8 inch roundover bit set so only the bindings are cut and preserving the purflings. Then I do a final sanding with a concave sanding form. Wow, with that, we're done with all the woodwork. And every time I get to this point, I'm reminded how detailed and challenging guitar building is, which is why the next step of applying a wash coat of shellac is so rewarding. It never gets old seeing the beauty of the wood magically coming forward. One technical tip is that dark woods can easily stain light woods, so it pays to turn your cloth to a clean side often so that the colors don't contaminate each other. This is especially important when wiping the purflings and bindings for the first time. So there you have it. We completed the box, which is a major milestone because it's really looking like a guitar now. But more significantly, we've created a complex acoustic system because now we have a structure where not only the surfaces vibrate, but also the air that we've enclosed. And all of these components interact. In the next episode, we'll get together and talk about these acoustic properties, which is pretty fascinating. So I look forward to seeing you then.